All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the first content session, which is led by one of our expert test prep tutors, Maggie Monahan. I'm going to hand it over to her, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end.
Hello, everyone in the internet world. As Kayla just so graciously said, my name is Maggie Monahan. I tutor the SAT, ACT, AP tests, subject tests. I enjoy a challenge, and I think that's one of the reasons that um, I so enjoy teaching for these tests. They are strange little puzzles that you just need to be able to know the process for. Yes, they are a very, very strange metric by which our society has decided to measure intelligence, and it's half of your job as a tutor is reminding students that it's not that. It's not an accurate measure of your abilities, but it is a necessary tool that we've adopted as a society to get people to where they want to go and to get more doors open for them. So glad that more people who are nice and kind and young people are getting excited about those kinds of things because students really respond to that. So sort of bouncing off a little bit of what Nathan said last week, I think that the test prep lesson scaffold that he presented is a really strong one. Doing a practice test for homework or at the beginning of the session, and then reviewing the test, going over potential mistakes or questions or things that were unclear as a way to start a conversation, and then selecting particular weaknesses or areas that they may be less confident in, and then drilling, investigating, and trying to figure out a game plan moving forward. Um, this is going to be pretty general, and I'm going to speak largely about the setup and the structure of this reading section because it is so particular to this test. Unfortunately, we as tutors kind of can't teach someone to read. You need to learn how to do it yourself, and that is something that in you will butt up against in your tutoring. But I I do think that the reading section is a really great way to start getting students ready for college level academic reading. So the SAT reading section does change a little bit from year to year. So probably from the last time you took it, as it was for me, it is structured a little bit differently, and the content can be different as well. Um, so almost uniformly in the last few years since they redesigned the SAT, to go back to the 1600 point structure and to change the content a little bit, they've had 5 passages for every reading section. So because there are 52 questions, you'll end up with 10, maybe 11 questions for each passage, 65 minutes. So I would encourage you to tell your students to start thinking of the test in terms of the groups of passages instead of thinking of them as I need to do one problem in 45 seconds or whatever. It's much more manageable thing to think of the reading and the answering the questions as one little bundle. Um, and then you can move on past that. So one thing that I think is helpful to equip students to be ready for is that you're going to start with the fiction or the sort of literary text. Then you'll go to social sciences or history, science, social sciences or history, and then science again to round you out. So they'll try to have for the 2 science passages, they'll try to have them um, from two really distinct uh, subjects or subsections of science. And then for the social science and history, they'll have maybe one from geography, they'll have one from another discipline in that area. Then one of these will be a double passage, which means that there will be two sort of little baby readings, where you do passage 1 and passage 2, and then and then you answer questions about each individually and about the way that they relate to each other. Those are often what we call the foundational texts. A criticism that the SAT had received in the past was that they weren't engaging with enough older texts, is that it was all sort of contemporary academic writing. So they're dealing with that by including largely important texts of like political philosophy from the UK, from the US, that are the kinds of things that we would read in a civics class or a history class in high school or college. So, for example, they have Mary Wollstonecraft, Vindication of the Rights of Woman. They'll have sort of, they've used documents from the Revolutionary War. So it's to help you get adjusted to that really formal, elevated language that's less common today. This order, I think, is kind of deceptive. Most students will see, oh, I know the fiction. That's the first one. That would be great. I love books. But they, of course, will find something quite difficult or quite dense literarily. And oftentimes the rest of the passages are much clearer and more straightforward. So just because it's like a happy, like, oh, I love literature mindset that you might have going into the beginning, those are oftentimes the densest and hardest passages in the whole thing. Sometimes they've had like Virginia Woolf as the literature passage, and I'm like, these poor kids sitting across the country just struggling, thinking, what am I reading? For example, the first passage in the reading test is the Lady Carlotta passage that I believe is now infamous among test prep tutors, which is about this woman who's standing on a train platform, and she's talking to all these people, and this guy comes up to her and he says, oh, you must be Mrs. blah, blah, blah. You are the new guardian for my children, and you're their nanny now. Come to us. You are the nanny. And she isn't the person. And that's sort of the whole point of the passage. This second passage is adapted from something called Strap Hanger, Saving Our Cities and Ourselves from the Automobile. So it goes into depth about the sort of, I guess, social science term of a strap hanger. As it says here, somebody who by choice or necessity relies on public transport rather than a privately owned automobile. And the author goes through this reading, thinking about public transportation, thinking about the environmental detriment of people owning private automobiles, and then public transport around the world being invested in the way that is improving lives. So then they talk about demographic changes in the United States that are encouraging this sort of strap hanger revolution. But it's written in a pretty straightforward and accessible way. So even if your students panic thinking, I don't know how to read social science, this is what it looks like. It's pretty clear, even if you don't understand all of the words involved. So one thing I would encourage students to look at or to not look at more accurately, is after they read this passage, their first impulse is going to be to look at these figures and to write down little notes about the percentages and that kind of thing. That is 90% of the time going to be a waste of their precious moments during the test. Let's just go and talk about some strategies a little bit more. Then we'll go on to a science passage. Let's go. Boop, boop. Here we go. Okay, so these are just a couple of basic things to encourage in students as you're starting off with them. when you're going into the test, half of this battle is psychological. Remind your kids you don't need any outside knowledge. You don't need to have some sort of advanced degree in English literature to be able to read these passages. The SAT has values that might be different than what your English teacher will ask of you, and so that's kind of the first couple times the mantra that I repeat to my wee ones, who are all taller than I am. The one thing is that you do need to shed your opinions. This is something that I particularly really struggled with when I was taking standardized tests, because I have a lot of opinions. And so I would read, whatever, Thomas Paine or some political document, and I would think, no, they're wrong. I'm right. I'm better than them. But the value that the test has is that they're looking for clarity. If you take away one thing from my talking to you all today, it's that the SAT cares about clarity and clarity alone. They don't value the most sophisticated ideas. They don't value the most nuanced and interestingly developed ideas. They care about clarity and conciseness. So when you're preparing, that's, I think, the first thing to prepare your students for. They're not looking for you to understand everything that they're saying. They're looking for your ability to see what is clearly, obviously happening. Then when you're going into the actual reading of the passage, there are a couple of strategies that I would encourage you to give to your students to have on the top of their minds that will help them once they get to the answering section. So as I was saying, the SAT they don't value sophistication, or not sophistication, they don't value complicatedness as much as they value clarity, which I think is actually a good thing. I think that it prepares students for the kind of values that college will impart on them. But so the kind of readings that they select are going to be clear and straightforward, and they're going to be kind of organized in a logical and formulaic way to a certain degree. I'd say that the one thing that will always help is checking the first and last sentences of the passage and of the paragraph. Reading, just in conjunction, the first sentence of the strap hanger passage and the last sentence of the strap hanger passage gives you the bulk of what you need to know. It might not be the most interesting part of the passage, like maybe you're more excited about the millennial baby boom conflict, but that's not what they're referring to in the first and last sentences of the passage or of each paragraph. They kind of tip their cards with those sections and those passages, to be frank. So it gives students these little anchors to grab onto as they're moving through the passage. Sort of a corollary to that, I would say, is that you can focus on the main ideas of each paragraph instead of focusing on the whole body of the passage as a whole. The students can get kind of overwhelmed with the randomness of the size of the reading, and the varying lengths of the paragraphs, and they'll think, oh, if it's the longest paragraph, it must be the most important one. But something that I've had a couple of students who are struggling with remembering the paragraph, and they're only remembering the end of the passage by the time they get there, is to literally write down the little main ideas of each paragraph in the margin. Just like 3 words, doesn't have to be much. And then they have a little bit of a cheat sheet for themselves. I think that the first and last sentences of each paragraph really help for that as well. So it doesn't have to be much. It could be like, what is strap hanger? What are environmental issues? Those kinds of little things. They don't have to be phrased like questions. It's just the way that my brain thinks. One thing that is also helpful for that is to encourage them to start flagging these transition words and these comparison and contrasting words. If every time that they see consequently, every time that they see in spite of this, every time that they see similarly, every time they see anything that describes some sort of opposition, they should be underlining those words or keeping a particular eye out for them. Underlining and circling are always good tactics in my book, because then you just literally have it physically there. And then it can be kind of these little handholds for your students as they're going through the passage. It's like, oh, well, they were talking about this one thing here. Oh, but then there's something that's contrasting. And even if they didn't have perfect comprehension, that they know that there's some kind of shift. Excellent. When you get to the reading itself, the impulse is really to spend a lot of time trying to engage in some really deep, thoughtful analysis, some really sophisticated contemplation of the content, and that's really not what this test gives you time to do. I'd say that you should focus on spending time on the big ideas, sort of the overarching themes. And then, because it is an open book test, students forget this all the time, you'd be stunned. You can just flip back and reread the details all the time. There's no need for you to focus so much on little words or little things, and to then not have enough time to complete and read all of the answers and all the answer choices. Skip the facts and figures, or visual data representation as they call it. You don't need charts. Those are, honestly, there'll be one question about one little tiny thing on one of those charts. You don't need to spend any time before you get to the questions working on them. Students really are looking for a challenge, and so if they find a really confusing word or a really confusing sentence or just a confusing idea, they'll stare at it for about 20 minutes, which is really admirable, because they probably will get it if they stare at it for a while. But those are the kinds of black holes that can destroy you on the test. If you don't know a word, you gotta let it go. You can't possibly learn something that you don't already know. You can't absorb 50 words of vocabulary before the test. And I think that the general overarching theme that I would encourage you to instill in your students in this chunk of the test is to move on. It's not worth getting stuck. It'll screw you over for the rest of the passage and the rest of the test. Move on. That is my spiel about the reading itself. Great. Let's hop a little bit. So this is an open book test. Half of your first session should just be saying, it's an open book test. It's an open book test. Have I reminded you it's an open book test? You can flip back to the passage, flip back all you want. Don't even turn the paper fully if it's on the next page. Just have your hand on one side and then just flip it back and forth. The going back and checking is so much better than trying to test your perfect memory. That is something that I wish that someone had told Maggie when she was 16. So I think that this is one of the hardest things to demonstrate to your students, but I think that it's really important, and it gives them a little bit more agency in this test. I'd say, and tell your students, anticipate what you think the answer should be. If you're reading it and you read if you've read the passage well, you already have all the information that you need to know. Some people literally will cover up the answers with their hand. I don't mind that at all. You can literally cover them up and say to yourself, okay, here's what I think the answer to this question is. What is a strap hanger? I don't want to, I'm going to cover it up. I think to myself, it's a person who doesn't have a car. And then I look back and I try to get their answer to match up to my analysis instead of the other way around. Instead of my trying to shoehorn my own thoughts, all the things that are percolating in my brain, into their weird hackneyed answers. They're designing all of these answers in order to trick you. There's no way around it. They are designing them all to sound really good, but at least 75% of the answers that they give are wrong. So this tricking is really to make you doubt yourself. It's intended to make you doubt your own analysis of the reading. And especially for really strong students, or students who have strong reading skills but might be struggling more with the setup of the test. Your job as a tutor will say, hey, kid, you're smart. You've read this. You understand what's happening. They're trying to have you get in your own way. But by saying to yourself, here's what I think it is, you prevent these sort of silly mistakes that go against your own analysis. I think that the most helpful thing that it can do is to help you reduce the chance of picking something that sounds good. The number of times you will hear that is going to make you want to bang your head against the wall. I hear a lot of, but it's so fancy, it sounds so good. And that is often working in opposition to what you know in your heart, I guess, is the answer based on your own analysis. Reading if there's a specific question that asks, okay, here's in line 30 or whatever, they refer to blah, blah, blah. What does that mean? The number of students who will blow right through that and just circle something that is right in their minds will astonish you. But when they go back, you read the entire sentence of that line, and if you can, which you just really focus on making this time for that moment, to read the sentence before the line, the full sentence that includes whatever they're citing in the problem, and the sentence after. Then you get the context of the information. You get whether the author is refuting that or is on board with that. You get a lot more of the relationship of the bit of information in addition to what the information itself is. And then I think that with your students, tell them just follow your gut when it comes to cutting out the nonsense. Everyone sat in some standardized test and there's some like really nonsensical answer that makes you almost laugh out loud, right? That impulse is so useful. If you respond to and follow that impulse of this is stupid, this is ridiculous, this is entirely irrelevant to whatever I'm reading, it really does help cut down your chances of silly mistakes and getting like really obsessed with the kind of black wholeness of the silliness, if that makes sense. I've had certain students say, oh, it's so silly, it's almost like it has to be real. Like, no, you had the right impulse, you had the right thought, and you still got sucked into it. They're trying to throw all these like shiny things in front of you and just cut it out. We're going to read Feathers with enthusiasm. This passage is adapted from Thor Hansen, Feathers, copyright 2011 by Thor Hansen. Sometimes these little introductions are very helpful. Remember that. They're not just chaff. Sometimes the answer is in the little intro thing. Scientists have long debated how the ancestors of birds evolved the ability to fly. The ground-up theory assumes that they were fleet-footed ground dwellers that captured prey by leaping and flapping their upper limbs. The tree-down theory assumes they were tree climbers that leapt and glided among branches. So that kind of information a student could so easily jump over, right? But I'm about to read an entire thing about jumpers and ground dwellers, and I could have a sense, but without any clarity, of what that means. And so I'm feeling very grateful for reading the little introduction. It also will give you the year, which is great for our foundational texts. At field sites around the world, Ken Dial saw a pattern in how young pheasants, quail, tinamous, and other ground birds ran along behind their parents. They jumped up like popcorn, he said, describing how they would flap their half-formed wings and take short hops into the air. So when a group of graduate students challenged him to come up with new data on the age-old ground-up, tree-down debate, he designed a project to see what clues might lie in how baby game birds learn to fly. So if I were to do those sort of main ideas, bouncing off of the first and last sentence of each paragraph, I'd say, Ken Dial saw a pattern in how pheasants ran along behind their parents. So when a group of graduate students challenged him to come up with new data, he designed a project to see what clues might lie in how baby game birds learn to fly. So the main idea is Ken Dial saw a pattern. He's going to make a project to see how the baby birds learn to fly. Ken settled on the chukar partridge as a model species, but he might not have made his discovery without a key piece of advice from the local rancher in Montana who was supplying him with birds. When the cowboy stopped by to see how things were going, Ken showed him his nice, tidy laboratory setup. Excuse me, I'm not caffeinated sufficiently. And explained how the bird's first hops and flights would be measured. The rancher was pretty incredulous. He took one look and said, in pretty colorful language, "What are those birds doing on the ground? They hate to be on the ground. Give them something to climb on." At first, it seemed unnatural. Ground birds don't like the ground. But as he thought about it, Ken realized that all the species he'd watched in the wild preferred to rest on ledges, low branches, or other elevated perches where they were safe from predators. They really only used the ground for feeding and traveling. So he brought in some hay bales from the chukars to perch on and then left his son in charge of feeding and data collection while he went away on a short work trip. So the main idea of this is learning about partridges, but you could do the first and last sentence trick and go, Ken decided on the chukar partridge, or I have no idea how you say that. If anyone knows things about birds, let me know. But he got helpful advice. The chukars were perched on some hay bales while he left town. It's kind of all you need to know. Barely a teenager at the time, young Terry Dial was visibly upset when his father got back. I asked him how it went, Ken recalled, and he said, "Terrible, the birds are cheating. Instead of flying up to their perches, the baby chukars were using their legs. Time and again, Terry had watched them run right up the side of a hay bale, flapping all the while. Ken dashed out to see for himself, and that was the aha moment. The birds were using their wings and legs cooperatively, he told me, and that single observation opened up a world of possibilities." You don't even really need the first sentence from that paragraph. Terry Dial was freaked out, but Ken Dial realized that they were using their wings and legs together. Working together with Terry, who has since gone on to study animal locomotion, Ken came up with a series of ingenious experiments, filming the birds as they raced up textured ramps tilted at increasing angles. As the incline increased, the partridges began to flap, but they angled their wings differently from birds in flight. They aimed their flapping down and backward, using the force not for lift, but to keep their feet firmly pressed against the ramp. It's like the spoiler on the back of a race car, he explained, which is a very apt analogy. In Formula 1 racing, spoilers are the big aerodynamic fins that push the cars downward as they speed along, increasing traction and handling. The birds were doing the very same thing with their wings to help them scramble up otherwise impossible slopes. So first sentence we'll give you, Ken came up with the experiments about going up ramps at different angles. The birds were using their wings to get up hard slopes. It's kind of all we need to know. Their wings weren't doing the flying, they were walking, but their wings were helping them to walk. Ken called the technique WARE for wing-assisted incline running and went on to document it in a wide range of species. It not only allowed young birds to climb vertical surfaces within the first few weeks of life, but also gave adults an energy-efficient alternative to flying. In the TrueCar experiment, adults regularly used WARE to ascend ramps steeper than 90 degrees, essentially running up the wall and onto the ceiling. Ken called his new technique WARE. Older birds could go up even steeper than 90 degrees. It's a cool fun fact, I guess. In an evolutionary context, WARE takes on surprising explanatory powers. With one fell swoop, the dials came up with a viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds, something gliding animals don't do, and thus a shortcoming of the tree-down theory, and an aerodynamic function for half-formed wings, one of the main drawbacks to the ground-up hypothesis. So from the last I got, in an evolutionary context, WARE takes on surprising explanatory powers, and viable origin for the flapping flight stroke of birds, and the aerodynamic function of half-formed wings. So if we were to take the first and last sentence of the whole chunk, just go, Ken Dial saw a pattern in how these birds were going around. Ken figured out something in between the flapping flight stroke of birds and an aerodynamic function. So he kind of splits the difference between these two theories. At the end of the day, that's all we need to know. Then this is the kind of question, our first question, which choice best reflects the overall sequence of events in the passage? Having these little handholds or these little notes of the main ideas of each paragraph to yourself will be really helpful because you can read them just in quick succession, and that gives you a sense of the flow of ideas and therefore the flow of the paragraph. So let's just anticipate. What do you think is how they structure the passage? I would say, it starts with this sort of anecdotal story about this guy, Ken, and then Ken was going to do it with this one kind of partridge, and there were all kinds of hijinks getting in the way, and then his son comes in and they realize that through the mistakes, they find out that the birds are using their wings and legs together. Then they did this experiment to figure out how their wings were angling. And then he called this is a technique that birds use, and it exists all over bird land. And then WARE explains a lot. So an experiment is proposed but proves unworkable. A less ambitious experiment is attempted and it yields data that give rise to a new set of questions. Okay, maybe. I don't know, we'll keep it in running. A new discovery leads to reconsideration of a theory. A classic study is adapted and the results are summarized. An anomaly is observed and simulated experimentally. The results are compared with previous findings and a novel hypothesis is proposed. Or an unexpected finding arises during the early phase of a study. The study is modified in response to this finding, and the results are interpreted and evaluated. So, as we're thinking through these kinds of things, we can go back to our little handy dandy cheat sheet. Open it. Anyone? See, yay! As we go on, there are questions like 22. where you just need to go back to the line. Challenged is used in line 7. So when a group of graduate students challenged him to come up with new data on the age-old ground-up tree-down debate, he designed a project. Come up with your own word. For those kinds of things, it's pretty self-explanatory. I think just tell students to substitute a word that would work for you. Like if you don't know what this word means, what word would you write in this sentence? His central assumptions in setting up his research, these are the more tricky ones. I think you got to go back and see a little bit of what and see a little bit about how Ken is designing the experiment. Luckily, they're pretty explicit about it in this one. These are the double questions are they're either really great or really bad, depending on whether you get them right. They're because they're sort of mutually assured destruction or mutually assured success. I'd say if you see those double questions, spend a little time on the first half. Be a little bit more specific with yourself about why you think that is happening, and then anticipate what lines you think provide the evidence for the question. These are new and they're definitely hard. In the second paragraph, the incident involving the local rancher mainly serves to, I would say, show how the rancher knows more than the scientist, in my colloquial speak. And there are only, like, that automatically knocks off A and D. And then that piece of information totally changes his research. Like, his whole process wouldn't have happened if he hadn't had hay bales, you know? And then his aha moment, like, your impulse is going to see, oh, aha moment, line 41. I'm going to just talk about the aha moment, but it's after he had his aha moment. What does he do? It's another case where reading the line before and the line that they're citing and the line after is really helpful. The passage identifies which of the following is a factor that facilitated the baby Trucar's, truly who knows how to say this bird's name, traction on steep ramps, the position of their wings. Yay, wing and foot together. Awesome. We've got a couple more. What can be reasonably inferred about gliding animals from the passage? Reasonable inferences are always quite difficult, and especially this one because it's a double passage. You just need to go back to the few mentions that there are there and think, well, what's inherent to this? Students, I think, struggle about, like, inherent assumptions and, like, the ideas that writing is predicated on. They're used to sort of, like, either being told that it's true or not true. But it can be difficult. Really quickly before we end, I want to just get to this is the Vindication of Rights of Women one. Just to get to this double passage. So this is quite, so passage 1 is from Talleyrand. And he is, how do I say, sexist. So you kind of have to get students to get on board with those kinds of things, to be able to read them for the ideas inherent, and rather than just saying I like it or I don't like it. But these are sort of not too brief passages, but they're very, very dense. And so I think the true reading of these passages is harder to avoid than for the science sections or the conventional social science sections. But then when it comes to the passages, I think encourage your students to do passage 1, do the first couple of questions that are about passage 1, then read passage 2, and then do the questions about passage 2 and the whole, and the questions comparing them. It's the authors of passage 1 versus the authors of passage 2. And you're focusing on the authorial intent and the way that those things differ. I have a lot, these are a lot of big ideas, like, hey, tell your students how to, be good at something. So I just want to leave some time to really talk about these things and these methods, and how like these strategies have really worked for me and certain students of mine in the past, or whether you have any reservations about things or something's not clear.
But Robert's question was, when I took the SAT, I remember rereading a passage many times and getting more confused. What would you tell a
Yes.
student like that?
Read it once, skim it once, just get the basics. Your brain will eat itself if you spend too much time on these questions. Every student has, every adult, every person who ever took a test has that same kind of experience. And so I'd say that for those students, say, you're not going to be able to get this perfectly. I don't need you to do a book report on this. This is open book. You don't need to be able to be the greatest expert on this. I just need to know that you understood what you were reading and get the gist. So spending a little bit of more targeted, but a shorter period of time on the reading, and then sort of backloading the time of the test, so that the answers end up taking the bulk of the reading experience, and going back and looking at all the different things that you read the first go around, will make a huge difference. I don't think that there's ever really been a situation in which reading a passage more than once has been helpful.
Mm.
I'm ready to be proven wrong, but I have yet to see it. Any questions at this point? Any things that are jumping out?
Oh, well, I think it's really difficult and challenging for kids, because in school, they're consistently told not to let things go,
Mm-hmm.
to take their time, to be thorough, go back if you think you made a mistake, and do it till you get it right. And I was just wondering if you had any strategies or examples of things you've seen or done with students, with those slower readers, with those really thorough kids, of how you can kind of practice with them and get them more used to that concept.
I think that the thoroughness is great, because like those are skills to, I think, encourage your students to cultivate in general, but not for this test, which is a hard line to walk, right? Like to say, like, I love this thing about your brain. I think it's great that you do this, but we're just going to have to let go of that for a little while. I think you can be really gentle and encouraging about it, but there's also a need to buy into the game that I think you need to sell them on a little bit.
Mm.
That makes sense. Like I'll show, if I'm talking to a student, like I could spend so many hours on the SAT. I could spend hours and hours and hours reading these passages and like coming up with thoughtful analyses of them. And I could do one passage in the time for 5. And they're not, it's just the nature of the beast that this is not a test that values thoroughness or complexity. It really does value clarity. And in school, we really are taught to engage in grade school and K through 12 education. We're taught to embrace the complexity. And I think that the real challenge of college is learning how to express complex ideas simply and with clarity, and getting students to sacrifice a little bit of the thoroughness for the sake of getting to the bigger ideas, is hard. And there's no way around the fact that it kind of sucks. but that will pay off for them in the rest of the test. I think just demonstrating the real upsides of acknowledging the game and playing it. It's hard. It's like, it's an emotional thing. It's an intellectual thing. It's those are all hard. For students that are really slow readers, I've had students who literally only read the first and last sentence of each paragraph.
Mm.
They skim the rest of it. And then that's their point of reference. They're like, I'm going to take a long time. Some of them, they take a long time on the questions in particular, and they're saying, I can take a long time on the reading or take a long time on the questions. I'm running out of time to be able to do both. And so because of the way that the writing is selected and structured, you really can skim certain chunks of it, frankly, if you know how to do it. Which is sad that that's what we're encouraging, but for better or for worse, it is the nature of the beast.
Kind of related to that, then, what sort of, because I imagine with math, right, you can come up with a million different practice problems to, practice a particular skill that's being assessed.
Yeah.
With reading, is there anything else you can use other than practice test passages to practice these same skills?
That's the difficult part, is that there aren't other readings that are really like this. It's like a very particular subset of nonfiction writing, with the exception of the fiction passage that they select. So, I mean, honestly, practice does make perfect, or at least it makes permanent. And the difficult thing is, right now, since the SAT was retooled, there aren't that many official practice sections to do. But just doing it frequently, I think doing it once a week makes a huge difference. Over the course of a couple of weeks, you give your brain some time to kind of let it marinate, but you get enough repetition in for, whatever, the 3 months before the test to turn on that part of your brain. I have had a couple of students who've wanted to do much more than that. And I'm like, okay, great. I'm going down into the barrel of sad SATs from the past. But they, if they want that practice, then good for them, good on them, It just is going to be not as accurate as the most recent, restructured SAT tests are.
Got it. And to what degree are literary elements assessed on this passage compared to the main or central idea?
Not that much. It's interesting. Like, it's not, the fiction is, they're really looking for your clarity of understanding, as opposed to being like, this is symbol for blah, blah, blah. So it's quite different from the way that we have English classes in high schools. And then with the other passages, it's just not the kind of thing that they're used to reading. And like literary elements wouldn't really apply as much. So I think that the one thing that I was really happy, I didn't think that any of my students would be able to like really engage in counter argument. But that is, I think, like the thing that they've learned in English class, that's like a term that they've used that is applicable here.
My last question for the moment is just, what kind of mistakes do you find students most commonly making on this reading section, besides looking for, the most sophisticated or complex idea?
I think that they forget to trust their gut. That's something I'm going to talk about in a little bit too, but like they think this answer sounds fancy. And even though I don't think it's the right answer, I think that it should be the right answer because of the way that it's phrased and because it sounds fancy. And they are smarter than I am, so why would I know better? Any more questions? I can send it back over to you, Kayla.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good stopping point. And I'm glad that Robert did ask that last question, because I think particularly for the reading sessions, it's going to be really helpful having read the passages beforehand so that Maggie can just sort of focus her expertise on the strategies and answers.
Beyond
You know,
my brilliant bird passage reading.
right, right. Well, your bird passage reading was brilliant. Let's not say otherwise, but more so, and I think also, so as participants we can bring our own perceptions,
Yeah,
as questions to you, and etc.
100%.
Yeah, and but I think it's a perfect stopping point, unless there's anything else. And thank you all for coming, and thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.
All right, have a great night.
Yay.
Okay, bye guys.